First dates are strange things. They exist in this weird space between excitement and danger. Because when you sit across from somebody for the first time, you're making hundreds of tiny decisions without even realizing it. Can I trust this person? Are they who they say they are? Am I safe here? And most of the time, thankfully, the worst thing that happens is an awkward conversation, bad chemistry, maybe getting ghosted afterwards. But every now and then, somebody goes on a first date and never comes home. Tonight's episode is about those stories, the dates that started normally, people who seemed charming, the moments that probably felt harmless right up until they weren't anymore. We're talking about stories involving manipulation, disappearance, murder, and people whose real intentions were hidden behind flirting, charisma, and carefully constructed identities. Danger rarely introduces itself honestly, and usually arrives looking attractive, funny, and safe. So lock your doors, turn the lights down low, and welcome back to Spill the TXC with me, your host, Amber. Picture this. It's the 1970s. There's no smartphones. There's no Find My Friends. There's no texting your best friend the guy's number plate before you get into the car. All you've really got is your instinct. And on this particular night, instinct may have saved two people's lives. So sometime in the mid-1970s, a young man and woman went on a first date. And unlike most movie love stories, there wasn't some instant spark, no dramatic chemistry, no fireworks, no moment where their eyes locked across the room and violins started playing. The date itself was just fine. Awkward in places, polite but forgettable. You know those dates where both people are trying very hard to be interesting while simultaneously wondering whether they'll ever speak to this person again after tonight? It was that kind of date. So they had dinner, they made conversation, they laughed occasionally, and by the end of the evening, neither of them were exactly planning a future together. In fact, according to the story, the woman later admitted that she didn't think she'd hear from him again. And honestly, I think he probably felt the same. So eventually the date winds down and he drives her home, or at least, almost home. Because before she gets out of the car, he suddenly turns to her and asks, "Do you want to do something exciting?" Now, immediately hearing that today, your answer would be absolutely fucking not, especially from a man you barely know. But according to the story, he explained that nearby there was a forest with a clearing where you could see the stars perfectly. And somehow, she agreed. Maybe it was the era. Maybe people trusted each other more back then. Maybe she just didn't want the night to end on a boring note. Whatever the reason, the two of them parked near the woods and started walking. And at first it actually felt kind of magical. The air was cold enough to make them walk close together. The trees swayed quietly overhead. Leaves cracked beneath their shoes as they followed the narrow dirt path deeper into the darkness. And strangely enough, this spontaneous little adventure started creating the chemistry the original date had completely lacked. Because excitement changes people. Adrenaline changes people. There's actually psychology behind this. When your heart rate rises and your senses heighten, your brain can confuse fear and excitement with attraction. So suddenly they're laughing more naturally, they're talking more easily, and the awkwardness just disappears. And at one point their hands brush accidentally and neither of them pulls away. And for the first time that night, something real starts building between them. But then the atmosphere completely changes. You know that feeling when your body notices danger before your mind does? That horrible primal instinct where suddenly everything feels wrong for no clear reason. The forest no longer feels romantic. It feels oppressive. The darkness feels heavier somehow. The silence feels unnatural. And according to the story, both of them noticed it at the exact same time. The sickening feeling that someone else was there, watching them. Now the terrifying part is there was no obvious reason for this fear. No footsteps, no voices, no movement in the trees, just instinct. But instinct can be terrifyingly powerful. So naturally they start walking faster. Not running, not yet, but quick enough that neither of them can pretend they're relaxed anymore. Their conversation fades. Now all they can hear are their footsteps against the dirt path just crunching. Faster, sharper, and more nervous. And then suddenly, the man steps on something soft. Not sticks, not mud, but something else. Something that immediately stops him dead in his tracks. And according to the story, in that exact moment, both of them are overwhelmed by this instinctive understanding not to look down, which sounds strange until you've experienced real fear, because sometimes your body reacts before your brain catches up, and apparently he froze. And she later described feeling this wave of panic pass silently between them without either of them speaking a word. And then, almost simultaneously, they turned around and started walking back to the car, quickly. And then faster. Then eventually they're practically sprinting through the woods without saying anything at all. Neither of them looks back. Neither of them stops moving. They get into the car and they leave immediately without seeing any stars. And according to the story, they never fully understood why they were so terrified that night. Not at the time, anyway. But strangely enough, that terrifying moment became the thing that bonded them together. Because after that night, they kept seeing each other. The chemistry they'd been missing suddenly existed, and eventually, they got married. Now, honestly, if the story ended here, it would be creepy enough, because who wants to walk through a dark wood with somebody they've just met, and then you step on something soft and your body's screaming at you not to look down, and then you both have to run out of the forest because your instincts take over and you know something's wrong? That would be enough, right? Well, this is where the story becomes truly horrifying. Because years later, the couple are at home together one evening. The TV's on in the background and they're only half paying attention, just living their normal married life, when on the news is coverage about a serial killer who had terrified America. A man responsible for the murders of numerous young women. And at some point during an interview, the killer is supposedly asked a question: were you ever close to getting caught? And he said yes. Once. He explains that he had murdered a young woman and was dragging her body through woodland near a path when a young couple unexpectedly walked through the area. And then came the detail that made the married couple freeze. He said, the man stepped on the body. Imagine hearing that. Imagine realizing the unexplained terror you felt years earlier may not have been your imagination at all. According to the story, the killer claimed he had been crouched nearby in the darkness the entire time, just watching them and waiting. He said that if either of them had looked down, if they had realized what they were standing on, he would have killed them too. But for whatever reason, they just turned around and left. And then finally, the interviewer revealed the name of the man telling the story. It was Ted Bundy. I think the real horror of this story isn't just the serial killer. It's the idea that instinct may have saved two people's lives before they even understood that they were in danger. That somewhere deep in the human brain, there's still this ancient survival mechanism quietly screaming warnings we don't consciously understand. And that young couple survived because they listened to it. There's something especially terrifying about stories involving first dates. Because first dates are supposed to be exciting. Awkward, maybe. Nerve-wracking, definitely, but exciting. You get dressed up, you tell your friends where you're going, you imagine the possibility that maybe this random stranger could actually become important in your life. And for 19-year-old Sade Robinson, that's exactly what happened on April the 1st, 2024. It was just a first date, nothing more. Sade was young, ambitious, and by all accounts incredibly loved by the people around her. Friends described her as outgoing, funny and driven, and she was balancing work and college and building a future for herself, trying to enjoy being young. She had her whole life stretched out ahead of her. And on that night she was excited enough to tell people about the guy she was meeting, a 33-year-old man named Maxwell Anderson. Now at first people didn't really focus on the age gap, 19 and 33. But hindsight changes everything. At the time, to Sade, this was just a date. According to investigators, the two met up in Milwaukee for dinner at a seafood restaurant before later going to a bar together. Surveillance footage reportedly showed them laughing, drinking, moving through the night like countless other couples on countless other first dates. And that's one of the most haunting parts of this story to me. Because somewhere in Milwaukee that night, people probably saw them together and probably thought, cute couple. Nobody around them knew that they were witnessing the final hours of a 19-year-old girl's life. As the night went on, investigators say Sade eventually went back to Anderson's home. Phone data and surveillance later helped detectives reconstruct part of her movements that evening. And then, she just vanished. The next morning, Sade didn't show up for work. Now, normally that might not sound immediately alarming, but according to the people who knew her, this wasn't normal behaviour at all. Friends and co-workers became worried quickly because Sade was dependable. She answered messages and she showed up. Calls went unanswered. Texts stopped delivering. And almost immediately, people close to her knew something was wrong. Then came the discovery that changed everything. On April the 2nd, a severed human leg was discovered in a park near Milwaukee. Imagine that for a second. Someone just walking through a park and suddenly realises they're looking at human remains. At first, authorities couldn't officially confirm who the remains belonged to. But as investigators dug deeper into Sade's disappearance, the nightmare only became worse. Her burned out car was discovered. Then more remains began appearing in different locations around Milwaukee and along Lake Michigan. A torso, an arm, other body parts scattered across multiple areas. Some of Sade's remains were never recovered. Even reading those words just feels unreal, because this wasn't some decades-old mystery buried in true crime history. This happened recently. A teenager went on a first date, and by the following day, detectives were searching beaches and parks for pieces of her body, and they didn't even find it all. According to prosecutors, investigators used surveillance footage, cell phone data, witness statements, and location tracking to piece together Sade's final movements. And the picture they say emerged was horrifying. Authorities alleged that after killing Sade, Anderson dismembered her body, scattered her remains across different locations, and burned her car in an attempt to destroy evidence. Now, one of the reasons this case hit people so hard online because it tapped into such a universal fear. Modern dating already requires an enormous amount of trust, especially for women. You're sitting across from somebody you barely know. You're trying to judge whether they're safe based on a few hours of conversation and instinct alone. And most of the time, thankfully, people are exactly who they present themselves to be. But cases like this remind people that sometimes they're not. And what makes this case even more devastating is who Sade seemed to be as a person. Friends described her as vibrant, motivated, full of energy. There are photos of her smiling in bright pink outfits. Pink was her favourite colour. And after her death, memorials filled with pink balloons and flowers appeared around Milwaukee. People who knew her talked about her kindness, her ambition, and her future. A future she never got the chance to live. Meanwhile, as the investigation unfolded, the case drew massive media attention across the country. Every update seemed more disturbing than the last. A body part discovered on a beach. Another discovery miles away. Searches continuing because not all of Sade had been found. And perhaps one of the most horrifying details of all is, even now, some of her remains are still missing. Think about what that means for her family. There's no true sense of completion, no ability to fully lay your loved one to rest. Just ongoing grief mixed with unimaginable horror. In 2025, a jury found Maxwell Anderson guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, dismembering a corpse, arson, and hiding a corpse. But even with a conviction, this is the kind of case that leaves a permanent scar on a city. Because underneath all the headlines and court documents is one simple, devastating truth. A 19-year-old girl thought she was going on a normal first date, and she never came home. This story has survived for years in true crime circles because of one simple reason. It preys on one of the most primal human fears imaginable. The fear of eating something you never should have eaten. So allegedly, this story begins with a woman going on a first date with a man she met recently. Normal enough, as normal as every other dating story starts. He seemed charming, polite, maybe a little intense, but not enough to trigger alarm bells. And according to the story, the date was going surprisingly well. Good conversation, drinks, chemistry, and at some point during the evening, the man suggests they go back to his apartment so he can cook for her. Now, already people listening to this are going to be split into two groups. Half are going to be thinking, well, that sounds romantic. And the other half will be thinking, absolutely fucking not. I'm in that half. You absolutely cannot go anywhere with somebody you've just met, and this is absolutely not victim blaming at all, because this is not the victim's fault. My God, this is not the victim's fault. But It's a lesson to us all, isn't it? That you can't go with people you barely know. But she agreed to go back with him. So they go back to his place. And at first everything seems normal. The apartment is tidy. The lighting is low. Music is playing quietly in the background. He's confident in the kitchen too, which makes the whole thing feel weirdly intimate. Apparently he tells her he loves cooking for people and wants to make one of his favourite dishes. Meatballs. Now here's the detail that always gets me about this story. She supposedly noticed the smell first. Not bad exactly, just strange. Different to how meatballs are supposed to smell. It was heavy, rich, almost metallic underneath the sauce. But she ignored it because what are you supposed to say? Hey, your homemade dinner smells vaguely threatening. So she eats it. And according to the story, almost immediately something feels wrong. At first it's subtle, a cramp in her stomach, nausea, heat rising to her face. But within minutes, it becomes unbearable. The kind of sickness that arrives violently and all at once. Now imagine this woman sitting across from a man she barely knows, whilst her body is suddenly going into complete revolt. She's trying desperately to stay composed, but she can feel panic building because this doesn't feel like normal food poisoning. This feels extreme. Her stomach twists and she starts sweating. Her vision blurs, and then comes the humiliation. Because now she's trapped in a stranger's apartment trying not to throw up, trying not to completely lose control in front of someone she's on a first date with. And eventually she can't hide it anymore. She rushes to the bathroom and becomes violently ill. And I mean violently. There's no other way I can say it. It was coming out from both ends. That's how ill she was. She was shaking and crying and convinced she's either been poisoned or is having some kind of medical emergency. Meanwhile, the guy's outside the bathroom door asking if she's okay. And apparently that's when she became truly frightened because instead of sounding concerned, he sounded irritated, cold, almost annoyed that something has interrupted the evening. Now at this point, survival instinct kicks in. The second she's physically able to move, she grabs her things and leaves. No dramatic goodbye, no explanation, she just gets out. And instead of going home, she goes straight to the hospital because deep down, she knows something about this feels deeply wrong. The doctors began treating her for severe food poisoning, but because of what she was saying, they also tested her stool. And this is where the story fully crosses into nightmare territory. Samples are tested, and then comes the phone call. The doctors tell her there's something highly unusual about the meat she's consumed. Something that should not have been there. Human tissue. Now stop for a second and just imagine receiving that information. Imagine sitting under fluorescent hospital lights after a first date and being told the meal you just ate has contained human remains. That's the kind of sentence that changes your entire relationship with reality. And from that moment onwards, police became involved. And when investigators started trying to identify the man she'd gone on the date with, well, they hit a wall instantly. The name he gave her couldn't be verified. The phone number was apparently some kind of internet-generated number not registered to a real identity. And his apartment was an Airbnb, booked using a prepaid voucher card purchased with cash. No traceable payment methods, no real address, no digital footprint, nothing. And suddenly investigators are faced with a terrifying possibility. The man may never have intended to be traceable at all. Think about that. Imagine realizing the person you spent an entire evening with may have been operating under a completely manufactured identity. Not just lying about his job or his age, but completely fabricated. By the time police attempted to track him down, the Airbnb had already been cleaned. No evidence, no belongings left behind, no indication he had ever truly been there. It was like he just vanished. And honestly, that's the detail that makes this story stay with me. It wasn't the meatballs, not even the possibility of what was inside the meatballs. It's the idea that this man may have carefully designed himself to disappear before the date even began. No trail, no identity, no way to find him afterwards. Which leads to the question that makes this story so deeply unsettling. If she hadn't have gotten sick, if she hadn't have quickly left, what exactly was supposed to happen to her that night? By the time you get to this story, you start realizing something so scary about modern dating. Some people aren't who they pretend to be. Usually that means filtered photos, and I think we're all a little bit guilty of that, including myself. if I'm completely honest. But then you get fake personalities lying about their height, and sometimes lying about things far darker. This is the story of Sydney Loofe. And honestly, this case scares me in a completely different way to the others. This wasn't some shadowy stranger lurking in an alleyway. This was somebody Sydney trusted enough to meet willingly. Somebody she thought she knew. Sydney was 24 years old. She was bright and funny and close with her family. People who knew her described her as warm and outgoing, the kind of person who made friends easily. She loved animals, she loved making people laugh, and she had a huge smile in photographs that made her seem instantly approachable. She also lived in the real world, which meant dating apps were just part of life. And in November 2017, Sydney matched online with a woman named Audrey. At least, that's who she believed she was talking to. The messages between them seemed normal enough. Flirty, casual, exciting in that nervous first date kind of way. And eventually they agreed to meet. And now here's what's so chilling about this case. Sydney actually told people she was excited. She sent photos, she talked about the woman she was meeting. She even checked in with her friends throughout the evening. Nothing about it initially felt dangerous. In fact, before the date, Sydney even posted a Snapchat selfie smiling in the passenger seat of a car with the caption, "Ready for my date." And that image became haunting afterwards, because people would later realise that they were looking at one of the last confirmed images of her alive. And at some point during the night, Sydney stopped responding to messages. And now at first nobody panicked, because adults do go quiet sometimes. People get busy, phones die. But as hours turned into a full day, concerns started building fast. This wasn't normal for Sydney. Her family described this growing sense of dread settling over them because something simply felt wrong. And eventually, they contacted police. Now, this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing. Investigators traced Sydney's final known interactions back to the woman she'd gone on the date with. Except, the woman wasn't really who she claimed to be. You see, Audrey turned out to be another woman named Bailey Boswell. And surrounding Bailey was a man named Aubrey Trail. Now, if you've never seen interviews with Aubrey Trail before, do not look them up alone at night. I'm serious. There's something deeply wrong about him in a way that almost radiates through the screen. He's cold, he's performative, and he's manipulative. And as investigators dug deeper, the situation surrounding Sydney's disappearance became more horrifying by the day. Because this wasn't just a random dating app encounter gone wrong. Police began uncovering evidence suggesting Sydney had potentially been lured into something far more dangerous. Something planned, something deliberate. Searches intensified. Volunteers combed through rural Nebraska, fields, roadsides, ditches, and then, weeks after Sydney disappeared, human remains were discovered in a rural area. The remains belonged to Sydney. Now, even by true crime standards, what happened after was shocking, because the investigation revealed bizarre claims involving manipulation, control, sex, deception, and what prosecutors later described as an elaborate fantasy world created by Trail and Boswell. At various points, the suspects made wildly conflicting statements. One moment denying involvement, another giving bizarre explanations, and then came one of the most infamous moments connected to the case. During a court appearance, Aubrey Trail suddenly shouted, "Bailey is innocent and I curse you all," before attempting to slash his own throat in court. Imagine witnessing that. A courtroom full of people suddenly watching a murder suspect erupt into chaos in real time. The footage spread everywhere because it felt less like real life and more like a horror film scene. But underneath all the spectacle and media attention was a devastating reality. A young woman went on a date expecting connection, excitement, maybe even romance, and instead crossed paths with predators. Now, what makes this case particularly terrifying is how ordinary it began. There was no masked intruder, no dramatic kidnapping, just messages on a dating app, and that's it. Something millions of people use every single day. And I think that's why Sydney's story stays with people, because it forces you to confront how vulnerable modern dating can make us. You sit across from somebody you met online and you make impossible calculations in your head. Are they safe? Are they lying? Who are they really when nobody else is around? And most of the time, thankfully, as we said earlier, the answer is harmless. But Sydney Loofe met two people who were anything but harmless. And what's especially heartbreaking is that by all accounts, she approached the date with so much optimism, excitement and trust. The very things dating is supposed to involve. Instead, her name became attached to one of the most disturbing dating app murder cases in recent memory. And honestly, I think the most terrifying detail of all of this is Sydney probably believed she was walking towards a completely ordinary first date, not towards the final hours of her life. Which means somewhere out there right now, people are getting ready for dates exactly the same way she did. Checking their reflection, sending a screenshot of somebody's profile to a friend, feeling nervous, feeling hopeful, completely unaware of who might really be waiting on the other side of that screen. After hearing stories like these, I think a lot of people ask themselves the same question. How do you spot danger before it's too late? Because the terrifying thing about every story in this episode is that none of these people walked into those dates expecting horror. Most dangerous people do not introduce themselves as dangerous. They introduce themselves as charming, attentive, intense, interesting. But according to a retired FBI profiler, there are certain phrases that can appear very early on that should make you pause immediately. Now, obviously, context matters. Not every person who says these things is secretly dangerous, but the profiler explained that manipulative people often use emotionally loaded statements very early in relationships to speed up intimacy, to lower boundaries, and create emotional dependency fast. And honestly, once you hear the phrases, you start recognizing how unsettling they actually are. The first one to look out for is, "You're not like other girls." Now, on the surface, that sounds flattering, right? But psychologically, what that statement actually does is isolate you. It separates you from other women. It makes you feel chosen. It makes you feel different and special. And according to the profiler, that can subtly discourage you from comparing notes with other people because now, in your mind, you're separate from the others. It's so simple and it's so clever. And it's something that would probably go right over my head. The second phrase is, "I feel like I've known you forever." Again, it sounds romantic, right? But when somebody says that extremely early on a first date, maybe only hours after meeting you, what they're really doing is collapsing boundaries quickly. Artificial intimacy. They're trying to create emotional closeness before real trust has actually been earned. And then there's the third phrase. "Nobody gets me like you do." Now, this one is especially manipulative because it activates empathy. Any emotionally healthy person wants people to feel understood. So subconsciously, hearing that can make somebody start emotionally investing faster, trying harder, wanting to maintain that connection. And suddenly, without realizing it, you're already carrying emotional responsibility for someone you barely know. And that's the scary part. None of these phrases sound threatening. They sound flattering, romantic even. And that's exactly why they work. The profiler's advice was brutally simple. If somebody you barely know is trying to fast-track emotional intimacy, overwhelm you with intensity, or make you feel uniquely responsible for them very early on, leave. Because real connection takes time. Healthy people do not need to emotionally accelerate a relationship within hours of meeting you. You're better off leaving with a what if than a never again. And after every story in this episode, I think that's probably advice worth remembering. And on that note, thank you so much for joining me today. I've loved talking to you, as I always do. I will see you next week for another episode of Spill the TXC. I love you. Bye.